Hello, and welcome to the next video in our series of Intro to Creative Web Dev videos that we've been doing this semester. So where are we? So far, you learned about JavaScript libraries, which let you load code that other people have written and then use that code in your own code. So for example, we saw a JavaScript library that gave you a function that like showed a fancier like alert dialog box. And of course, we know about P5 since we started learning about that, which itself is a JavaScript library that lets you do things like call the circle function, for example. And you do that by adding a script tag that has a source attribute that points to the JavaScript file that contains the JavaScript library, or the JavaScript code that you wanna load into your project. And okay, so that's JavaScript libraries. And the other thing that you know how to do by now is to use CSS by loading like a style.css file into your HTML, which then has like selectors and stuff to style your HTML elements. Okay, so we're going to build on those two things in this video to talk about like one of the most popular JavaScript libraries out there called Bootstrap. And Bootstrap is a JavaScript library, and it's also a CSS file. And I'll talk about what I mean by that in a second, but it lets you make sort of, I don't know, professional looking web pages without a ton of effort on your part. And I'll talk more about that as I go, but that's the sort of 30,000 foot view. Okay, so just to get started, I'm going to jump over to a project in Replit. And I've loaded some code in here just to have something to work from. But right now, all it does is contain a bunch of HTML tags, a bunch of divs with some classes. Right now, those classes are not styled. So it's just the default styling. And there's stuff like here's an H1 tag, a P tag, a button tag, which gives me this sort of default styling over here in my web page. So hopefully that's not anything too shocking. That's nothing new. This is all just HTML tags. You've seen them before. Shouldn't be scary. And classes that I haven't actually styled yet. So from here, I could style these classes in my CSS file exactly like you would have seen before. So for example, I have this .card class. So I could go over here and maybe I'll say .card. And I'll give it like a border of thin, solid black. And I'll run this, and it didn't work. Why didn't it work? Because I need to load my style.css file. Let me get that line of code. I should have prepared this a little bit better, but let me find that line of code real quick. If I go to my HTML tutorials, CSS, external, here we go. This line of code. You would think by now I would remember it, but I never do, so it's okay. So now I'm going to have this HTML tag, this link tag, which will load the style.css file. Okay, so I needed that piece to the puzzle. All right, so now that I have that, my style.css file styles the card class over here, card class, and it gives it a border of thin solid black. And I could keep going. I could style all of the classes that I've used here. So card header right now just says unstyled card, so I could give that a style. So if I go back here, I could say like .card header and give that, I don't know, maybe I'll give that a color of red just to get something working. And if I run that, now I see that the header is red and the card itself has this sort of black border. And from here, I could keep going. I could mix and match all of the sort of CSS style rules that you've already seen until this looks the way I want it to look. Now, depending on how you feel about CSS, that can get pretty tedious. And it can be really difficult to get something that just kind of works, that just kind of looks like a, in quotation marks, real web page. And so maybe I just don't want to do it. And that's where stuff like Bootstrap comes into play. That's where Bootstrap comes into play. So Bootstrap is two things. The first of which I'm going to talk about is basically a CSS file. which itself contains a bunch of styles that you can use. Okay, so I'm going to, where'd that go? Oh, I made it go over there. Oh my goodness. I think it's fixed. Okay, so I'm going to go to a search engine, Google, DuckDuckGo, Bing, whatever you want to use, and I'm going to just type in like Bootstrap JavaScript library. And I'm going to go to their homepage. That's this one. And just like we talked about before with JavaScript libraries, what I'm doing is looking in the docs for like the line of code that lets me load the library in the first place. It's going to be like an HTML tag. So it's two things. First of all, it's a CSS file, and then it's also a JavaScript library. So I'm going to take this line of code, the line of code that loads the Bootstrap JavaScript library, and I'm going to replace what I have here. And this gives me some extra stuff that I don't think I care about, so I'm going to get rid of that. But this line of code is very similar to the line of code I just had, where I was loading my style.css file, but now I am loading the bootstrap.min.css file. This is a normal CSS file that contains a bunch of like rules for styling various classes and elements and whatnot. And now that I've loaded it into my into my HTML file, I can use those classes in my HTML. And so to show what that looks like, I'm just going to hit run. And now you see that my card here has some styling that makes it look a little more professional, a little more reasonable. And I can customize this. I can add, I can change the content and whatnot. But the idea is that because I am using the classes that Bootstrap has defined for me, I don't really need to worry about the styling myself anymore. So to maybe talk about like how this is working, maybe I'll just open up this file. So usually if it's a min file, it's got like weird syntax where they've like eliminated all of the white space to make the file as short as possible. So let me get rid of that min and maybe I can get to the main file, and here we go. So this is a CSS file. So if I do like a control F for like a card, yeah, here you go. Here you see the styling properties that Bootstrap has defined for the card class. So here you see it's like flexbox and has some stuff about like borders and border radius. And if I go back here, that's what's happening here. That's where these styles are coming from. They're just coming from Bootstrap's CSS file. So that's half of Bootstrap. And to talk about the next thing, there's a couple things I want to talk about. The other thing is a JavaScript library, and the other thing I want to talk about is like how do you know which classes to use. Let me maybe talk about the JavaScript library part next. So let me go back here and remind myself of what I want to talk about. So yeah, let me maybe replace my HTML with another example. I'm just kind of stealing this from myself. So I'm going to replace my HTML with this other example HTML just to kind of talk about it. And I'm going to get rid of, actually, I'm going to keep that around. No, I'm going to get rid of it. Okay, so what I have is now I'm back to just a normal HTML file. And the HTML itself contains a few things. It contains a UL, which is an unordered list, and it's like a bulleted list, and each LI contains an A tag, so it's like a list of links, basically. And I'm formatting that for my own sanity, but it doesn't really matter. So I have this button, this div, and then a button inside of the div, which is the oh my button here, and then a UL, which is this list here, and then that list contains 3 sort of elements, and that's just default. That's just pure HTML, no styling, no JavaScript, no anything. This clicking this button doesn't actually do anything, and from here, I could add some CSS to my style.css file to make the, like maybe I want this to be a drop down, and maybe I want to style the bulleted list here so it's not showing bullets anymore, and maybe it's like hidden by default or something. And then I could add JavaScript, which like when I click this Oh My button, maybe it shows the list element for me, and that would be a way to create the drop down element here, and that would work. I could do that. I could spend half an hour here coding that up. But what if I don't want to? And that's where Bootstrap comes into play. So let me load, first of all, I'm going to load the CSS. I'm going to load that in here. I'm going to get rid of some of this extra stuff because you don't actually need it. And then I'm going to load the JavaScript library, which is just like we were talking about in the previous video. It is a JavaScript file which contains a bunch of code that is now loaded into my web page. So I have loaded a CSS file here, exactly like I have loaded any other CSS file. And I've loaded a JavaScript file, exactly like we've already seen loading like the script.js file or any other JavaScript library. And I'm going to run this and let's see what happens. So now notice that I haven't changed my HTML. I haven't added any JavaScript. I haven't added any CSS. I've just loaded Bootstrap. And what Bootstrap gives me is now the button has this styling. It has this like triangle. If I click on it, now I see my drop down, which is coming from the HTML that I defined, but I didn't have to do any of the styling or any of the JavaScript code myself. All of that comes from Bootstrap. So that's sort of the power of Bootstrap. Okay, so that's sort of like the why of Bootstrap. So now you know what Bootstrap is. It's a CSS file and a JavaScript file. And now you know like why it's useful. It helps you code up a web page without doing a lot of the coding yourself. So now what? Now comes like, how did I know how to use these classes? How did I know that like having a button with like this magic combination of classes and whatever this is, how did I know to use that? How did I know that that would make my div here turn into a dropdown? Well, the answer to that is way back in week 1, I told you that coding is mostly reading documentation. It's also debugging and a little bit of swearing when stuff doesn't work, but that's still true. In week 13 or wherever we are, coding is looking through documentation. So here on Bootstrap's webpage, I'm going to look through their documentation and I'm going to sort of point you to a few specific things over here. So specifically, the things that you probably care about are the idea of components. So I'm going to click over here in components. And this starts talking about like the classes that you can use. So button primary, button success are some example classes that you can use. And where am I going? I want to, over here in the left menu here. Components here. And then you see that these are kind of the components that Bootstrap offers. And component is just a fancy word for like, here's a drop-down component. It's just an element that you put in your web page that just kind of works. So we are looking at the drop-down component in my example. So here's the reference for the Bootstrap drop-down component. And you can see that you have some example code here that does something. I'm pretty sure I just straight up stole this example for that example that I was using, but you can do other things as well. So you can have like colors, you can have like these fancy things where it's like a button with a drop down. You can change the size, all these things that you can do, but you figure it out by reading through the reference. So I don't know, I haven't planned this ahead, I never really do, but let's say that I wanted to add like a carousel to my web page. And a carousel is, well, let's just click the reference page and look at it. So a carousel is like an HTML component that has like slides kind of, where you look at like one at a time and you can kind of click through them. And you've probably seen this kind of thing like on like a home page. There's often like images in like a slideshow or something. And again, I could code this up myself. I could create like an image tag with some buttons, and then the button would have like an on click where I change the image that's showing. I could do that, but I don't have to. So what I can do is take the code from this example and let's see. I'm straight up just going to copy it actually. So I want to add this carousel to my web page. So my web page is over here. I'm going to maybe just clear some of this out. Maybe I'll add some like just placeholder stuff. So like maybe I have a h1 tag. It's hello world, and I want a like carousel of maybe pictures, maybe just text for now underneath that. So I'm going to paste that in, and it's kind of messy because my screen is super tiny so that you can see it a little bit better on the video, but it's a div, okay, and then another div, okay, and then a button, and then a button. That's not too bad. Let me actually just run this. This might break. I think that this is just an example and I need to like fill in some blanks, but let's just see what happens. Yeah, okay. I need to fill in the blanks. So maybe let me say, instead of an image, I'll just say like h2, 1, and then I'll have like 2 and 3. 2 and 3. Let's just see what this does. Oops, spelled 3 wrong. Let me run this. So my carousel is kind of goofy because I think it's designed for like an image. So the there is a left arrow here and there is a left arrow over here, but it's like white on white, so it kind of looks a little goofy. What do I want to do? Do I want to look up images? I guess I do. It's gonna be annoying. But let's go to Wikipedia. Let's steal some images from Wikipedia. Can I just copy your address? Will you be kind to me? Yeah, I think that'll work. So I've got one. Actually, let me just steal this. Let's do 3 of the same video. 3 of the same image. All right, fine. There we go. So I have my image, and you can see that there's a left arrow here and a right arrow over here. So if I click the right arrow, it goes to the next image. In my case, it's the same image, but you know, it works. And I didn't really have to worry too much about like how to get it working, how to like write JavaScript that handles the on click for those left and right arrows, like how to do any of that. All I did was go to Bootstrap, look up some documentation for an example of how to use this component, and then I kind of filled in the blanks. So if I look at this kind of more carefully, I see that there's a div with an ID. I actually don't think this ID matters too much. Maybe it does. You can remove it and see what happens. But it's got these classes, carousel, slide, and these are classes that Bootstrap styles. Bootstrap's CSS file styles, and Bootstrap's JavaScript file uses to show the sort of interactive component to it. And then it's just a bunch of HTML where I've got like 3 divs, and it looks like carousel item defines like one of the sort of pages in the carousel, and active, I guess, is maybe just the default. I'm kind of guessing at some of that, and I could probably read more in the reference, but that looks like how it works. And so I can probably do something like h2, maybe I'll have a 1 here, and I can probably add to this HTML to sort of build out my carousel. But notice that, like, again, I'm not worried too much about like how to show this h2 tag or hide this h2 tag. I'm just going to let Bootstrap handle it for me. So if I run it, yeah, now I've got 1. If I go to the next one, yeah, 2, 3. So you can think of, you know, other ways that you might use this to show, I don't know, maybe samples of your work, or maybe, I don't know, links to other places, or really anything. But again, the important part here is you don't have to code all of the functionality yourself. You're kind of using the power of Bootstrap to do it for you. So I could run through a bunch of other components, but I kind of encourage you to just do what I just did and click around in the in the reference here and look for other things that you might use. So I don't know, what is a spinner? Um, Looks like it's like a loading spinner. Okay, that's kind of cool. There's like placeholders where you might have seen this, where like if you're loading something, you might show a placeholder temporarily. And this is how you would do that. You would use something like Bootstrap to do it for you. Or things like, I don't know, navbar is another really popular one where if you want a navbar that kind of like lays itself out and maybe contains some fancier components, maybe like a drop down, all this kind of thing. How would you do that? Well, you could code it up yourself. You could write the HTML and CSS and JavaScript yourself, or you could use Bootstrap. And okay, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time like showing a bunch of examples of components because hopefully by now you can kind of do that yourself by copying some of the code from the reference into your own project, seeing what happens and experimenting. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on like going through every single component, but I encourage you to check those out. A couple of things I do want to talk about is, let's see, I do want to mention grid. Grid is a feature of Bootstrap that's, if you remember back to like our Flexbox week where we learned about like ways to lay out your elements in the page, Bootstrap has its own take on that, which is called Bootstrap Grid, where it's probably over here somewhere. I just do a Control F for grid. Yeah, layout. So there's a bunch of options here. Grid is a really popular one where Bootstrap will help you lay out your page in terms of like rows and columns. And it's really useful for things like if you want your page to kind of lay out differently between like mobile and desktop, for example. Again, you could code that yourself. You could write the CSS that does that yourself. And you did some of that in the Flexbox week, or you could use Bootstrap to do it. And so I'll maybe not ramble too much more about grid. I'll just kind of point out that it is a thing. You can go read about it. You can read about it here in my sort of tutorial page here, or you can get it straight from the source here over in the Bootstrap reference. But Bootstrap Grid is a thing. Maybe read about it if you want to learn more about laying out your components in Bootstrap. Okay, what do I want to talk about next? So next I want to talk about the idea of maybe custom styling. So there's a couple ways I can do that. So right now, let me maybe go back to my previous example of this styled card. Right now, what I have is some HTML that styles this content so that it looks like this card. And I am using Bootstrap. I am loading Bootstrap's sort of default CSS file here, which gives me some styles, and they do look reasonable. They're okay, but chances are you don't want to just stick with like Bootstrap's defaults. Chances are eventually you'll want to add like your own styling on top of Bootstrap. And that's totally doable. You can sort of mix and match however you want. So for example, I'm going to steal this line of code, and maybe after Bootstrap, I'm going to load my own style file here. So style.css. This line of code shouldn't be new. This is loading my own CSS file exactly like you would have already seen, but nothing is stopping me from loading both. I'm loading Bootstrap's CSS and I'm loading my CSS, which means that I'm not just stuck with Bootstrap's styling. I can add my own styling. So if I go back to style.css, okay, I have some styles in here left over from when I was talking about it before, so maybe this will just work. If I run this, yeah, it does. So you see that I am, first of all, in my index.html file, I am using Bootstrap classes, which correspond to Bootstrap components. So this class represents or tells Bootstrap that this div is a card, and then Bootstrap's CSS styles that card. It gives it this like rounded border thing, gives it you know, some of the background colors and stuff, and you know, same thing for all of the other classes. Bootstrap styles it, and then this line of code loads my style.css file, and I also style those classes. So the card header, for example, up here has things like, I don't know, this like border down here, like right here, that's coming from Bootstrap, and that's great. And this red color, that's coming from me. So I can sort of override Bootstrap's default styling however I want to. And you can kind of mix and match between the two. Okay, so that's styling adding your own styles on top of Bootstrap. The other thing I want to talk about when we get to like customizing Bootstrap's styling is the idea of themes. So like one of the takeaways that I want you to get from this video here is that Bootstrap is two things. It's a CSS file and a JavaScript file. And okay, the CSS file gives me some of those default styles that you can see here, but Bootstrap is a bunch of class selectors, or a bunch of like classes and other selectors in CSS. That means that you can style them however you want. And that means you're not limited to Bootstrap's like default styling. There are many different ways to style Bootstrap's classes. And you can do it yourself, just like what I just talked about. Or if I go to a search engine, I type in Bootstrap themes, and there's just a bunch. Actually, I think this is how Bootstrap makes money, is like Bootstrap itself is free, but then they sell their themes. I think that's how they find, I think that's how they profit. But there's also a bunch of free ones as well. So let me find one that I like here, this one. And the themes are really just CSS files. So let me show you what I mean by that. Let's see, if I go here, I'm going to like open this up in a new window maybe. Sure, nope, that downloaded it. Can I open you in a new tab? Yeah, so I want this URL. And I'm going to go back to my HTML, and here where I'm loading the CSS file, I'm loading Bootstrap's CSS file. I'm going to replace the URL, which currently points to the Bootstrap CSS file, and I'm going to change it to the themes CSS file. So I'm going to paste that in, and I'm going to run it. And ooh, now it's this kind of spooky, like dark theme, and it has, this kind of custom styling, which is like a theme, but it's still bootstrappy. It's still like, it's still got the sort of default styling that you might expect, where like the card is kind of a rounded rectangle with like some text in it that has some fonts and whatnot. And like there's a button here, but it's not just the default. So I can kind of switch back and forth between the two. If I run that, and you can pick and choose. You can go to a Bootstrap theme webpage and find one you like and use that theme file to style your webpage, pretty much however you want. And then you can also, you can mix and match with your own style.css files as well. So I don't know, if I open up this one in a new tab, and then I go back here and I replace this. And yeah, let's run that. And here's, a different way of styling it. It's kind of this weird blue thing, which kind of looks almost like 3D-ish. I don't know. But my HTML didn't have to change. I didn't have to do any custom styling myself. I can if I want to, but I didn't have to. And that's sort of the power of Bootstrap. Okay, I've been rambling too much. This video is too long. I'm sorry for that, as always. But let me summarize, and then I want to talk about something, I don't know, kind of philosophical, and we'll see how that goes. So to summarize, Bootstrap is two things. It is, one, a CSS file, which gives you some styling for classes that you can use in your HTML. Two, it is a JavaScript library or a JavaScript file, which in a similar way to the CSS file, looks in your HTML and adds some behavior based on the classes that you use. The classes that you use come from Bootstrap's reference, specifically the components section and the layout section can be useful places to look. This will tell you like what classes to use to implement different kinds of behavior used in um, used in Bootstrap. Okay, so that's Bootstrap in a nutshell. That's what Bootstrap gives you. Then you can look through the reference for other components and whatnot, and get them working in your web page to have like a professional, reasonable looking site without doing all of the work yourself. Next, I talked about custom styling, where you can either add your own CSS in your own CSS file to style those Bootstrap classes, or you can use Bootstrap themes. You can actually use all of the above together. And a theme is really just a different CSS file which gives different styling to the Bootstrap classes. Okay, so that's Bootstrap. And so now you know how to go forth and use Bootstrap in your own projects. The last thing I want to talk about is, we'll see how this goes, sort of philosophically, like Bootstrap pros and cons. I very much want to leave it up to you, like how you feel about Bootstrap. I see it as pros and cons. I see some things that Bootstrap helps you with. I also see kind of some downsides of Bootstrap. But I'm going to kind of leave that up to you. But the takeaway that I want to leave you with is, okay, this week you have to learn about Bootstrap because that's what we're learning about. But I don't want you to feel like you have to use Bootstrap in order to build a web page. You can. Bootstrap can make your life a little easier, but don't feel like you have to. If you want to code your own CSS, if you want to code your own HTML, I say go for it. I actually think that modern HTML and modern CSS has come a pretty long way, and you now can do things that maybe when Bootstrap was first released, it was a little harder to do those things. But anyway, I just want you to maybe just keep in mind that Bootstrap is a tool that you can use, and if it makes your life easier, cool, awesome, great, go for it. But don't feel like you have to use it. One of the reasons that I am talking about Bootstrap in this class is Bootstrap itself, you know, take it or leave it. But the idea of using these kind of frameworks or libraries, if you continue doing web development, you won't get away from it. So there's another one that's really popular called Tailwind, for example. This is like the latest and greatest way to do it. It's very similar to Bootstrap, where you are adding classes to your HTML, and then Tailwind is a CSS file that styles it. So that's one. There's another one like React, for example. React is a little different because I don't think React cares so much about CSS, but it is like a JavaScript framework where you are kind of thinking in terms of the library. So when you are using Bootstrap, you're not just thinking in HTML anymore. You are now thinking in Bootstrap. So you're thinking in terms of like, what classes do I need to use? What elements do I need to use? In what order do I need to put them? And you're kind of at the mercy of Bootstrap. And that can be good because you do get a lot of functionality from it, but it does come with the cost of now you have maybe a little less freedom to do whatever you want. So I don't know. I'll leave you with that. I'll just say that Bootstrap is an option, and there are many similar things out there where you'll use something that makes your life easier because it does a lot of things for you, but don't feel like you have to. If you want to code your own HTML and CSS, go for it. In fact, I generally code my own. Okay, I'm going to shut up there because I'm getting rambly. Okay, so that was Bootstrap at a 30,000 foot view. In the next video, I'll talk about like using Bootstrap in a project, but hopefully this helped sort of introduce the concept of Bootstrap and most importantly, pointed you to the Bootstrap reference where you can get more information. But all right, I'm going to shut up and have a good one, and I'll see you in the next one.